I should have said no when Daniel asked me to join him for the hunting trip, but the words never left my mouth, and instead, I found myself nodding before I could think it through, and maybe that was the first sign that something inside me had been waiting for a reason to escape my routine life, because deep down I knew this trip wasn't just about hunting or forests or even friendship. It was about something I hadn't let myself face for years. Daniel had been in my life for over a decade, the kind of friend who disappeared for months but reappeared like he had never left, easy to be around, confident, without arrogance, and always carrying that quiet strength that drew people toward him without him even trying. I told myself it was admiration, just simple respect for someone who lived freely. But as I stood there watching him lean against my doorway with that half-smile, I couldn't deny that there was more buried underneath. Something I had never let surface. "Come on," he said casually. "One night out in the woods, no phones, no noise, just you, me, and the fire." I tried to laugh it off, shaking my head, saying I had work piling up, deadlines I couldn't ignore. But even as I spoke, I could tell my excuses sounded weak. Daniel chuckled like he could see through me and said, "You've got vacation days you never use. Just take one." I looked past him into the kitchen where Emma was rinsing vegetables, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, focused on chopping onions, and I waited for her to glance our way, to ask what we were talking about. But she didn't even pause, didn't even seem to notice Daniel was there. That tiny detail stung in a way I couldn't fully explain. "I'll think about it," I muttered. But even then, I think I knew I was going to say yes. That night, after dinner, Emma sat across from me, scrolling through her phone while we picked at our food in silence, the clink of cutlery, louder than any words between us, and I wondered how we had gotten here. She hadn't done anything wrong, and neither had I, at least not yet. But it felt like we were sharing a house, not a life. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling long after she fell asleep, her breathing slow and steady while my thoughts ran restless. I thought about the first year we were together, how she used to talk to me about everything, and how I used to look forward to hearing her voice. But somewhere along the way, we stopped listening and just kept moving forward, because that's what couples do when they don't want to face what's missing. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and it was a short message from Daniel, leaving Saturday at 6 a.m. pack light. No question mark, no follow-up, just a statement, like he already knew I'd come. I put the phone back without replying, but I didn't delete the message either. By morning, Emma was rushing out for work and barely kissed my cheek, already running. Late and I stood in the doorway with my coffee, wondering why my chest felt heavier than usual. I told myself the trip would be harmless, just a night away to clear my head, maybe even give me space to think about what Emma and I needed. But even as I zipped up the duffel bag on Friday night, I could feel a quiet excitement humming in the background, an energy I hadn't felt in a long time. Daniel picked me up right on time, his truck spotless as always. And when I climbed in, he gave me that easy grin and said, "Knew you'd say yes." I didn't reply, just rolled my eyes and buckled my seatbelt. But the truth was, I hadn't really tried to say no. The road leading out of town was still damp from an early morning drizzle. And as Daniel's truck rolled past the last cluster of houses, I felt the weight of civilization slip away with each mile. He kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the open window, the cool breeze tousling his hair in a way that made him look almost untamed. I tried to focus on the scenery, the shifting greens of pine and oak, the winding asphalt stretching like a ribbon, but I kept catching myself watching him instead. He didn't notice, or maybe he pretended not to. Daniel had that kind of ease about him, the ability to make silence feel like a choice rather than an absence. We spoke sporadically about small things, mostly about the weather, the roads, a new trail he wanted to show me. But under each word, there was something else simmering, something neither of us addressed. After 2 hours of driving, the pavement gave way to gravel, and the truck rattled as it climbed higher into the hills. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the turns like someone who knew every curve of this land. "We're close," he said, glancing at me briefly, and I nodded, though my mind wasn't on the destination, but on how strange it felt to be heading somewhere so secluded with him and no one else. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning its slow descent, spilling golden light through the treetops. Daniel parked near a clearing and killed the engine. The sudden silence rang louder than the hum of the truck. He hopped out and stretched his arms wide, breathing in the air like it was something rare and precious. "Smell that?" he asked. I inhaled and caught the scent of wet earth, pine sap, and faint traces of wood smoke drifting from somewhere far off. "Better than exhaust fumes," I replied, and he chuckled, tossing me one of the packs. "Come on, daylight's not going to wait for us." We started up the trail, Daniel moving ahead with practiced ease while I adjusted to the uneven ground. The forest seemed alive, humming with unseen activity. The distant call of a hawk, the rustle of squirrels darting through branches, the occasional crack of twigs under our boots. Every sound felt amplified, as if the trees themselves were listening. "So, how's work been treating you?" Daniel asked without turning around. "Same old routine," I answered, sidestepping a loose rock. "Deadlines, meetings, the usual grind." You know me," he said with a shrug. "I'd rather be out here than behind a desk any day." We fell into a rhythm of walking and talking, our conversations drifting between old memories and present frustrations. At one point, Daniel slowed his pace so we were walking side by side. He pointed toward a ridge in the distance where the tree line broke open. "That's where we're setting up camp. There's a stream nearby and good cover from the wind." I followed his gaze and spotted the faint shimmer of water glinting in the last streaks of sunlight. Something about the view was calming, like stepping into a painting untouched by time. By the time we reached the ridge, the light had shifted to a dusky orange, and Daniel moved quickly to unload the gear. We worked in tandem without speaking much, him gathering firewood, me unrolling the tent canvas. Yet every motion felt strangely synchronized, like we had done this before, even though we hadn't. As we finished setting up, Daniel struck a match and lit the small pile of twigs he had arranged meticulously. Flames licked upward, crackling softly, casting shifting shadows across his face. For a moment, I simply watched him, the firelight catching the angles of his jaw, the faint smile playing on his lips as he coaxed the flame higher. I forced myself to look away, focusing on arranging the sleeping bags inside the tent, but the awareness lingered. Once the fire settled into a steady burn, we sat opposite each other, the warmth chasing away the creeping chill of the forest. Night. Daniel reached into his pack and pulled out 2 cans of beer, tossing one my way. I caught it clumsily, and he smirked. "Still got those slow reflexes, huh? Maybe you just have unfair aim." I shot back, and we both laughed, the sound echoing faintly through the clearing. We sat drinking in companionable silence, watching sparks spiral into the darkening sky. After a while, Daniel spoke, his voice quieter, more thoughtful. "You ever wonder if we're just stuck? Like we do the same things over and over and call it living?" The question caught me off guard, and I took longer than I should have to answer. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I try not to think about it too much." Daniel tilted his head, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Maybe thinking about it is the only way to change it." His words hung between us, heavy but not uncomfortable, like a truth waiting for acknowledgement. I didn't respond right away, not because I disagreed, because I didn't trust what I might reveal if I spoke too quickly. Instead, I looked toward the trees, noticing how the moonlight filtered through the branches in scattered silver beams. Night settled in fully, and the forest around us shifted tone. The cheerful rustle of birds gave way to the distant call of an owl and the rhythmic chirping of crickets. The world felt both vast and intimate, endless yet enclosed within. The glow of our small fire. Daniel leaned back on his elbows, gazing upward. "Look at that sky," he murmured. I followed his gaze and saw a sweep of stars cutting across the darkness, clearer and brighter than I had seen in years. City lights had long robbed me of sights like this. For a brief moment, the sight stole my breath, and in that pause, I felt the strange mixture of peace and tension that only solitude with another person can bring. Daniel didn't look at me when he spoke next, his eyes still fixed on the constellations. "Glad you came," he said simply. I opened my mouth to reply, but found no easy words. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick, expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. I set my empty can down, noticing how close our boots had shifted toward each other without either of us realizing it. That thought stayed with me as I crawled into the tent later, listening to the faint crackle of the dying fire and the steady rhythm of Daniel's movements outside. I closed my eyes, but instead of sleep, I saw the way his face had glowed in the firelight. And I wondered why my pulse quickened every time I thought of it. The forest had gone silent by the time I stirred awake. The kind of silence that feels alive, pressing in from all sides. A faint glow from the fire outside bled through the thin fabric of the tent, flickering just enough to keep me aware of every shadow shifting across the walls. I turned over, expecting to hear Daniel's breathing nearby, but his sleeping bag was empty. For a moment I lay still, debating whether to close my eyes again, but something in me refused to let go of the wakefulness. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The smell of ash and pine sharp enough to cut through the lingering drowsiness. Daniel was sitting by the fire pit, legs stretched toward the embers, one elbow resting casually on his knee as he stared up at the stars like a man waiting for answers. He didn't look at me when I emerged, just nudged a small log closer to the fading flames. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone low, almost tentative, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the night itself. "Something like that," I replied, rubbing my arms for warmth as I settled onto a nearby log. The heat from the coals reached me slowly, mingling with a faint crackle of burning wood. We sat there without speaking for several minutes, and I found myself stealing glances at him between the bursts of orange light, wondering how many years I had ignored moments like this. How many times I had forced my attention elsewhere because it was easier than acknowledging what I felt. Daniel leaned back on his palms, exhaling softly. "You ever think about how small we are out here?" His voice wasn't philosophical so much as curious, like he genuinely wanted to know my answer. I tilted my head back, following his gaze, to the endless black canvas overhead littered with stars. "Yeah," I admitted. "Makes everything else seem less permanent." He glanced at me then, a fleeting but focused look, and it was enough to make me shift uncomfortably, though I didn't want to move. "That's not always a bad thing," he said, almost smiling, but not quite. I tried to laugh, but it caught in my throat, coming out as more of a breath than a sound. Something in the air had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the pause between a question and the moment you realize you already know the answer. Daniel picked up a small stick and poked at the coals, sending a few sparks spiraling upward, their glow fading before they could touch the sky. "I keep telling myself I'm fine," he said quietly, "that I don't need more than what I have. But some nights—" He stopped, letting the rest trail off into the crackle of the fire. I should have left it there. I should have let his words dissolve into the night and gone back to the tent, zipped it shut, and buried myself in sleep. But instead, I asked, "What happens on those nights?" He didn't answer immediately. He just set the stick down and leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "I think about how much time I've wasted pretending I don't want something." The statement hung there, heavy and honest, and my pulse quickened in response. I told myself it was just a moment of raw friendship, two people sharing what they usually kept hidden. But that excuse sounded weak, even inside my own head. "Daniel," I started, but my voice cracked, betraying. Too much. He finally turned fully toward me, eyes steady, unflinching. "You don't have to explain," he said, though the way he held my gaze made it clear he wanted me to. I swallowed hard, my chest tight enough to make breathing feel like an effort. Every instinct screamed to step back, to rebuild the walls. I'd kept up for years, but I didn't move. Neither did he. The night seemed to hold its breath with us, waiting. Slowly, like testing the weight of each second, Daniel shifted closer. The space between us shrinking until I could feel the heat of the fire mingling with the warmth of his presence. He didn't rush, didn't reach out suddenly, just let the moment expand until it felt impossible to ignore. "This is dangerous," I muttered, though the words sounded hollow even to me. "Only if you think you'll regret it," he replied. His voice wasn't challenging, just calm, almost reassuring, and something in me broke under its quiet certainty. I didn't remember leaning forward, didn't remember when the distance disappeared completely, but suddenly his lips were on mine, tentative at first, like both of us were afraid of what might happen if we gave in too quickly. The kiss was brief, barely a second, but it burned with everything unspoken. Every glance we'd brushed aside, every thought we'd buried. When he pulled back, I stayed frozen, torn between moving closer and fleeing entirely. I started, but the word died before it formed. Daniel's hand hovered near mine, but didn't touch, as if waiting for permission. I stared at the space between us, realizing that nothing would be the same after tonight, no matter what choice I made. My mind flashed with images of Emma, of the life we'd built, the familiarity of it. The promises we'd made, and guilt surged hard enough to make me flinch. I pulled my hand back slowly, not in anger, but in hesitation, and Daniel nodded, like he understood more than I'd said. "It's okay," he murmured, his tone free of judgment, and somehow that hurt more than if he'd been upset. I stood abruptly, needing motion to release the tension coiled tight inside me. "I should get some sleep," I said, though the words felt weak, like they were covering something far larger. Daniel didn't stop me, didn't try to follow, just watched as I ducked into the tent and zipped it shut. Inside, the air felt stifling despite the cold outside, and I lay down with my heart hammering, the sound loud enough that I swore it could be heard through the canvas. I stared into the dark, knowing I wouldn't find rest, not with the taste of that kiss still lingering, not with the question of what it meant pressing against every thought I tried to suppress. The first light of dawn crept across the forest, floor in pale streaks, filtering through the mesh of branches and spilling into the tent with a muted glow that felt almost intrusive. I blinked against it, disoriented for a moment, before the memories of the night before returned in a rush so sharp it made me sit up too quickly. The air inside the tent was cool and smelled faintly of damp fabric and smoke, but underneath it was the heavy scent of guilt I couldn't shake. Daniel's sleeping bag was empty again, but this time I could hear him moving outside, the occasional scrape of metal against metal as he packed gear. I stayed still for longer than I should have, debating whether stepping out would feel like an acknowledgement or an escape. Finally, I pushed the zipper down and ducked into the open, greeted by a thin layer of mist curling low across the ground. Daniel was crouched by the fire pit, tossing dirt over the last of the embers until they hissed into silence. He looked up briefly, offered a neutral nod, and went back to what he was doing without a word. The casualness of it felt deliberate, as if we had both silently agreed to pretend nothing happened. I busied myself with rolling up the sleeping bags. every movement exaggeratedly precise, needing something to focus on besides the weight pressing against my chest. "Coffee?" Daniel asked after a few minutes, his voice even but softer than usual. "Sure," I said, though my throat felt tight. He handed me a tin mug filled halfway, and I took it carefully, our fingers not touching, both of us conscious of how much effort it took to avoid even accidental contact. We drank in silence, watching the mist dissolve as the sun climbed higher. The forest that had seemed so alive and welcoming last night now felt different, heavier, almost accusatory, as though it had witnessed everything and was holding judgment in the stillness of its branches. When it was time to break camp, we moved with wordless efficiency, each of us packing and checking supplies without needing direction. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it lacked the easy rhythm we'd shared the evening before. Once everything was loaded into the truck, Daniel finally met my eyes for longer than a second. "Ready?" he asked simply. "Yeah," I said. And that single word felt far more loaded than it should have. As we drove down the winding trail back toward civilization, the trees closed in overhead, their shadows slicing across the windshield like reminders of things best left unspoken. Daniel kept his focus on the road, hands steady, expression unreadable. I stared out the window, watching the scenery blur into streaks of green and brown, my thoughts too tangled to form anything coherent. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge what had happened, to explain, to apologize, but every attempt started and stalled before it reached my lips. About halfway down, Daniel turned on the radio, letting low static-filled music fill the space between us. It wasn't loud enough to drown out the tension, but it gave us something to listen to. That wasn't our own silence. By the time we hit the highway, I had rehearsed 3 different versions of a conversation in my head and discarded them all. The closer we got to home, the more I felt the weight of reality creeping back in, layering itself over everything like armor I didn't remember putting on, but now couldn't remove. When Daniel finally pulled into my driveway, he let the engine idle for a moment, his hands still on the wheel. I reached for the door handle but paused, glancing at him. "Thanks," I said, and even though it was meant for the trip, the word carried far more than gratitude for a ride. He gave a small nod, his expression gentle but guarded, then shifted the truck into reverse as I stepped out. I watched him drive away until his taillights disappeared around the corner, the fading sound of his engine leaving an emptiness in its wake. Standing there in the morning sun, I felt like I had left part of myself somewhere back on that ridge, sitting by the fire under a sky too wide to contain what I was feeling. When I walked into the house, Emma was in the kitchen pouring coffee, her hair still tousled from sleep. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of soft, familiar smile that had once been enough to center me after any long day. I forced my own smile, in return setting my bag down by the door as she asked about the trip. "Good," I said automatically, and the words sounded thin, like it didn't belong to either of us. She kept talking about plans for the week, about a dinner with friends, but her voice felt distant, muffled behind the noise in my head. I stood there nodding in the right places, waiting for the guilt to push me into confessing, but it never came as words. It just sat heavy in my chest, unmoving, unrelenting. Later, when she left for errands, I found myself alone in the living room, staring at the half-sipped duffel bag, wondering if it looked different now, if it carried something visible to anyone who looked closely enough. I sat down on the couch, elbows on my knees, running both hands over my face like I could scrub away the memory of that kiss, of the way my heart had raced, not just with temptation, but with recognition of something I had denied for too long. I didn't know what it meant for me, for us, for anything beyond the fact that it had happened and could not be undone. That night, after Emma went to bed, I stayed in the kitchen long after the lights were out, staring out the window at the deep, empty street phone in hand, but no courage to use it. Daniel hadn't texted, and neither had I. Maybe we were both waiting to see who would break the silence first. Or maybe we both understood that whatever words came next would carry consequences. Neither of us could predict. I set the phone down, but my reflection in the glass lingered, looking back at me with a question I couldn't answer. Was it a single mistake born from isolation and chance, or was it the most honest moment I'd allowed myself in years? I didn't know. What I did know was that I couldn't stop replaying it, no matter how much I told myself I should. Asterisk.